I've been hiking in the woods that surround my town since I was a teenager. The town itself isn't large, just another patch of homes and shops tucked into the folds of hills and tree lines. But the woods seem endless. They stretch for miles in every direction, cut with only a few winding roads and trails that people use during the day. I know them better than most. When I can't sleep, I walk the paths. When I want quiet, I disappear under the canopy of pines and oaks. Sometimes I push myself deeper, far enough that the sound of cars or the faint glow of porch lights disappears completely. There's something in that silence that makes me feel separate from everything else, like I can breathe in a way I can't when I'm home. I've gone out so late that I've ended up watching the sunrise through the branches. The air damp with morning fog and the soil underfoot cold with dew. I like those nights most of all, when it feels like I walked through the entire night and earned the new day. But one night out there burned itself into my mind in a way that nothing else has. I still think about it whenever I see a thin line of smoke in the distance or hear branches snapping in a way that doesn't sound like deer. It started on a night that wasn't any different from the rest. I left my house around 10, boots laced, jacket zipped, backpack light on my shoulders. I brought water, a flashlight, a knife I always carried, and a thermos of coffee because I knew I'd probably be out until the sun came up. The streets were empty as I walked through town, just the hum of a streetlight and the occasional bark of a dog muffled behind a fence. The night was mild, warm enough that the woods would be comfortable, but not so warm that bugs would be unbearable. Perfect for walking. Once I cut past the last houses, the woods swallowed me. The trail was familiar, wide at first then narrowing, the dirt damp but not muddy. The trees on either side leaned overhead, their branches clashing in the slight breeze. I kept walking, deeper and deeper, the rhythm of my boots on the ground steady. I didn't turn on my flashlight yet. The moon was strong enough to light the path in silver and shadow. After an hour, I reached one of the deeper paths, the kind most people in town never used. It bent away from the main trail and disappeared into thicker brush. I knew it well. I'd taken it dozens of times, sometimes all the way to the ridge where you could see the whole town in the distance. I followed it without thinking, letting the quiet wrap around me. The deeper I went, the less the woods felt like something I knew. That's always how it feels after midnight. During the day, you notice the same fallen tree, the same bend in the stream, the same patches of moss. But at night, everything blurs. The trees seem closer, the path narrower, every sound sharper. You notice things you would ignore in daylight. The creak of a branch, the distant rustle in the underbrush, the sudden stillness that falls when animals sense something. I kept walking, sipping from my thermos now and then, keeping track of how far I was by the way the path rose and dipped. It must have been close to 2 in the morning when I saw the first sign that something was different. Smoke, faint, gray, rising up between the trees. I stopped and watched it for a long moment. Out here, smoke always meant someone. Hunters, kids sneaking a bonfire, or maybe a homeless camp. It wasn't uncommon to see little fire pits near the edge of the woods, but this was deep, deeper than where most people bothered to go. My first thought was curiosity. Who would bother making a fire all the way out here? I decided to follow it. I left the trail and pushed through brush, moving carefully so I didn't make much noise. The smoke was steady, not the kind that came from a fire going out, but one that was being fed. It wasn't long before I saw a faint glow through the trees. I slowed down then, my boots sinking into soft ground. My breath held as if I didn't want whoever was there to hear me. When I finally stepped into the clearing, I froze. It looked like a shanty town had been dropped in the middle of the woods. Crude little huts stood in a rough circle, each one made of whatever someone could find. Scrap metal, sheets of plywood, plastic tarps, bed sheets stretched tight and tied between trees. They weren't big, just enough for someone to crawl inside and sleep. In the center of it all was a fire pit. Only it wasn't a real pit. It was the hollowed rim of an old rubber tire filled with burning wood. Flames licked out of it, smoke curling into the branches overhead. The fire was alive, burning strong, but there was no one there. The clearing was silent. The shanties looked lived in. A cracked cooler lay beside one, half buried in dirt. A pair of shoes sat outside another, like someone had stepped out of them and gone barefoot into the trees. There were tin cans stacked near one corner, an old blanket draped across a branch, even a rusted pot blackened on the bottom from being held over flame. From the look of it, the place could have held at least a dozen people, maybe more. Yet the clearing was as quiet as a grave. I stood there for a long time, watching, waiting for someone to move. Nothing did. The only sound was the faint pop of wood inside the burning tire. It didn't make sense. Fires don't start themselves, and no one builds shelters like that just to leave them behind in the middle of the night. If they had run off, why leave shoes? Why leave food? Why leave the fire burning, something that could draw attention for miles? My first instinct was to back away, but my curiosity rooted me. I stepped closer. The ground was packed dirt, flattened by footsteps. I could see them, bare prints, boot prints, all jumbled together. I crouched and touched the ground near one of the huts. It was warm from the fire. I looked inside one of the shelters. A rolled-up sleeping bag lay against the wall, dirty and torn. Beside it, a plastic bottle half full of water. No one inside. I moved to the next. A pile of clothes neatly folded, as if waiting for their owner to come back. Another hut had a cardboard box filled with odds and ends. Rusty nails, a broken flashlight, the cracked face of a clock. None of it valuable. I circled the fire, glancing into each structure, each one empty. I felt my chest tightening, my stomach heavy with unease. Whoever had been here had left fast. Too fast. Then I noticed something that made me stop. Near the far edge of the clearing, almost hidden in the dirt, was a fresh smear. Dark, wet, not yet soaked into the ground. I didn't need light to know what it was. Blood. It was faint, just a line, but it trailed into the trees beyond the clearing. My throat went dry. The fire, the shelters, the shoes, the folded clothes. Suddenly it all felt different. This wasn't just a camp. Something had happened here. I stood there with my heart pounding, the fire crackling behind me, the woods pressing in on all sides. I knew I shouldn't be there. If someone came back and found me standing in the middle of their camp, I didn't know what they'd do. And if whoever had bled had been dragged into the woods, I didn't want to know by who. I forced myself to turn away, to head back toward the trail. I moved quickly but quiet, every step deliberate, ears straining for sound. The woods seemed louder now. Twigs cracked in the distance. Wind shifted branches. The night carried noises I hadn't noticed before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Took me longer than I thought to find the trail again. My sense of direction, normally sharp, felt dulled by nerves. When I finally saw the familiar path, I almost ran. I didn't want to make noise. I walked fast, my eyes darting to every shadow, until finally I reached the broader trail that would take me home. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the sky, I was back near the edge of town. The houses looked strange after what I had seen, their neat fences and trimmed lawns too clean compared to that clearing of hovels in the woods. I didn't sleep when I got home. I sat at the window watching the sun rise, replaying it all in my head. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back once, 2 afternoons later, when the sun was high and the woods felt harmless again. I wanted to see it in daylight to prove to myself it had been real. When I found the clearing again, my stomach dropped. The huts were gone. The fire pit was cold. The only sign anything had ever been there was a few scraps of plastic caught in the underbrush and the faint black stain of burned rubber on the dirt. The blood smear was gone too, either washed away by rain or trampled into the soil. It looked like nothing had ever happened. But I know what I saw. I know the fire was burning. I know those shoes and folded clothes and that smear of blood were real. And I know that whoever built that shantytown hadn't just wandered away. I don't hike as deep anymore. I still walk the trails, still breathe in the quiet at night, but I don't go looking for smoke in the distance. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be found, because when you do find them, sometimes they're already watching you. I've always liked to hike alone. The woods that spread out around my town aren't famous. Not the kind of place you'd see in a park brochure or a tourism website, but they've always drawn me in. They're thick and winding, full of old-growth trees and hidden trails. Places where you can disappear from the noise of everything else and just listen to the crunch of leaves under your boots and the hum of insects. Most people don't wander far into them, not at night anyway, but I've gotten used to it. Sometimes I'll go so late that the sky starts lightening before I come back, and I'll get to see the sun burn through the branches while I'm still a mile or two from the edge of town. I never thought much about danger before. Sure, I knew there were deer, raccoons, the occasional black bear passing through, but I'd always convinced myself that nothing in those woods had much interest in me. I stayed on the trails I knew, I carried a flashlight, and if I felt uneasy, I reminded myself that it was just the dark playing tricks on me. That mindset held strong until the night I stumbled across something I'll never forget. It was late, probably past midnight, when I went out on one of my longer routes. I liked to stretch it out when I couldn't sleep, sometimes walking until I felt my legs ache, and this was one of those nights. The woods were still, almost unnaturally quiet, as I went deeper. The moon wasn't very bright, so the beam of my flashlight cut ahead of me in a narrow tunnel. I remember thinking that the air felt heavier than usual, like it was holding its breath. About an hour in, I picked up on a faint orange glow through the trees, far off the trail. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the more I looked, the more certain I became that there was firelight flickering in the distance. My first thought was that maybe someone else was out there camping, which wasn't unheard of but definitely unusual in those woods. Most people didn't camp there because it wasn't regulated, and there were no clear sites for it. Curiosity pulled me toward it, even though part of me knew I should have just turned back. As I got closer, the glow turned into a small fire burning low inside what looked like the rim of an old tire. The light stretched out in crooked shadows across the clearing, and I realized what I was looking at wasn't just a campfire. It was a whole cluster of makeshift shelters. They were thrown together with scrap wood, bent sheets of metal, and even torn bedsheets strung up like walls. It looked like a shanty town, something built with whatever was scavenged and carried in. I stopped just outside the clearing, my flashlight low at my side, and took it all in. There must have been at least half a dozen little huts, maybe enough space for a dozen people to live out here. Old chairs, buckets, and broken furniture were scattered around. A couple of battered backpacks leaned against one of the shelters. The fire wasn't big, but it was burning, and it looked tended, like someone had made sure it wouldn't go out too fast. But there was no one there. The clearing was silent. No voices, no footsteps, no movement. I strained my ears, waiting for something. Laughter, coughing, the sound of people shifting in their makeshift beds. But there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the trees above. The longer I stood there, the more wrong it felt. If this was a camp, why would everyone vanish and leave the fire going? Why leave possessions out in the open where anyone could walk by? I told myself maybe they'd gone further into the woods to do something, maybe even just to avoid whoever was approaching. And then the thought sank in heavier. What if they were watching me already? The hair on the back of my neck lifted. I realized I had wandered right into the middle of something I didn't understand. It wasn't just that the place was strange. It was the quiet, the unnatural stillness, like I had stepped on a stage that wasn't meant for me. I should have turned back right then, but I felt rooted in place. My eyes darted over the shelters, the shadows they threw, the objects left behind. I noticed a pair of worn shoes half buried under a blanket, a cracked pot sitting near the fire, a jacket draped over a branch. The kind of things people needed. They hadn't been abandoned for long. I kept my light low, not wanting to shine it directly into any of the shelters, but I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were already on me from somewhere deeper in the trees. Every rustle of leaves made my stomach knot. I tried to steady my breathing, but the silence pressed in harder the longer I lingered. I finally forced myself to take a step back. The crunch of my boot on the leaves felt unbearably loud. Another step, then another, my body moving slow like I was afraid to draw attention. I kept my light aimed at the ground, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I turned back once, just to glance. The fire popped, sparks jumping into the air, but nothing else had changed. The shelters sat there like empty shells, waiting. As soon as I slipped back into the thicker trees, I picked up my pace. I didn't run, not yet, but I kept moving fast, trying to put distance between myself and that place. My flashlight swung ahead of me, catching on roots and branches. Every few steps I looked over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone trailing me in the dark. But there was nothing, always nothing. I don't know how long I walked before the tension in my chest started to loosen. Maybe half an hour, maybe less. It was hard to tell with adrenaline rushing through me. I kept replaying the scene in my head. The fire, the hovels, the belongings left behind. I knew now what it probably was. A homeless camp. People who lived out there because they had nowhere else to go. People who didn't want to be found, not by strangers, not by law enforcement, not by anyone. And that was the part that chilled me the most. The silence hadn't been because no one was there. It had been because they didn't want me to know they were. While I was standing in their clearing, staring at their shelters and their fire, they had likely been just out of sight in the dark trees, watching me. The thought made my skin crawl. I pictured pairs of eyes peering through branches, watching every move I made, waiting to see if I was a threat. If I had lingered too long, if I had stepped closer to one of those hovels, maybe things would have ended differently. Maybe I wouldn't have walked out of those woods alone. By the time I reached the edge of town again, the first trace of dawn was showing in the sky. The pale light cut through the trees, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe. The woods behind me were still dark, still hiding whatever had been there, but I was out, safe. Even now, when I think about it, the detail that sticks with me most isn't the camp itself. It's the fire, the fact that it was burning steady, untended, when I walked into that clearing. Someone had set it, someone had been there moments before, and yet they'd vanished into the trees, not because they weren't home, but because they were watching, waiting, deciding. That was the last time I hiked that deep into the woods at night. I still go sometimes, but only in daylight, and even then I find myself scanning the shadows more than I used to, because I know now that in those stretches of forest, you're never really alone. You might think you are, but someone could be watching from just beyond the treeline, silent, patient, hidden in the dark. I go hiking in the woods near my town a lot. They aren't the deepest woods in the world, but they're dense enough that when you step a couple miles in, it feels like you're far from everything. I usually go in the evenings after work, and sometimes I stay out long enough that I end up seeing the sun rise on my way back. The quiet of those hours is something I've always liked. It's different than walking in the day. At night, the woods feel heavier, the silence thicker, and every sound carries so much more weight. One night, I went deeper than I usually do. The air was cool, and there was a thin layer of fog clinging low to the ground in patches. The moon wasn't bright enough to light the whole path, so I was relying on my small flashlight, but I kept it dim to not blind myself. I had been out for hours and was already far from the parts of the trail most people know. That's when I came across something that didn't belong there. At first, I thought I was seeing shadows where there shouldn't be any, shapes that didn't match the trees. As I got closer, I realized they were man-made. Small structures, a cluster of them. What I can only describe as a shanty camp stood in a clearing. There were crude shelters made from scrap wood, old bed sheets, pieces of tarp, and corrugated metal. Someone had gone through the trouble of dragging a bunch of junk into the woods and arranging it into places to sleep. There was also a fire pit in the center. It wasn't made of stones like most campsites I've seen, but out of an old burned-out tire. Inside it, flames were still flickering. Someone had fed it not long before I arrived. Smoke rose in thin strands into the air, and the glow lit the area in uneven patches. The strange part was the silence. It was past midnight. The woods were dead quiet, and the camp was empty. No voices, no movement, no rustling from anyone shifting around in the shelters. Just that burning fire sitting there as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. I stopped on the edge of the clearing and just listened. My first thought was that it had to be a homeless camp. I'd heard rumors of people living out in the woods around town, people who didn't want to be found. That made sense, and it explained the way the shelters looked. The thing that didn't make sense was the fire. If they were hiding from someone, why leave a fire going? It was like a signal in the dark, something you could spot from far away if you knew what to look for. I stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do. Curiosity pulled me in. I crept closer, stepping carefully so I wouldn't crunch the leaves too loudly. The shelters were even rougher up close. Old mattresses leaned against frames of branches, plastic bags tied together as makeshift tarps. There were random belongings scattered around. Shoes that didn't match, empty cans, torn blankets, a child's stuffed toy so weathered it looked like it had been rained on dozens of times. The fire gave off just enough warmth that I could feel it, but the clearing still felt cold. Too cold. It wasn't just the air. It was the kind of cold you feel in your chest when you know something isn't right. My stomach tightened. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. That's when the thought hit me. Someone was there. They just didn't want me to find them. The shelters weren't empty by accident. People had heard me coming, my footsteps on the trail, maybe even the crunch of branches when I slipped earlier, and they had melted back into the trees. They were still nearby, just out of sight, waiting, watching. I felt it, that pressure of unseen eyes on me. The woods were too quiet, like every living thing had paused to see what would happen. I scanned the tree line with my light, but the beam only cut a thin path through the black. Nothing moved, but the feeling didn't go away. I could imagine figures standing just beyond the reach of the light, their faces hidden by the dark, their bodies still, blending into the trees. I told myself to leave, to just turn around and walk back the way I came, but my legs felt heavy. Part of me was locked in place, listening for any sound that would prove me right. Then I heard it, a soft snap of a twig from somewhere in the woods. Not loud, not close, but enough. I froze completely, my ears strained. Then another sound, from the other side, a shift in the leaves. Someone was moving out there, maybe more than one person, circling. The fire popped behind me, and I nearly jumped. I realized standing there in the open was the worst possible thing I could do. I turned slowly, as quietly as I could, and started walking back toward the trail I had come from. My steps were careful, deliberate, but I couldn't shake the sound of faint movement pacing me, keeping distance but not letting me go. The farther I got from the clearing, the faster I walked. I didn't dare run because running felt like it would trigger something, like it would give permission for whoever was out there to break cover. But my body was screaming at me to move faster. After a while, the sounds faded, or maybe I just convinced myself they did. Still, I didn't slow down until I recognized the trail that would take me back toward town. Only then did I breathe properly again. The woods seemed less oppressive the closer I got to the edge. When I finally stepped out of the trees and saw the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, I let the tension out of my body all at once. My legs felt weak, and my hands were shaking. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see figures emerge from the tree line, but nothing ever did. That night stuck with me. The image of that camp, the fire burning in the center, and the silence all around. It never left. I knew then that while I had been poking around their camp, someone was definitely watching me from the woods. They just didn't want me to see them. And the worst part is they were good at hiding. If I hadn't stopped to think about it, I might have convinced myself it was just an empty camp. But it wasn't. It never was. I still hike those woods sometimes, but I never go that deep anymore. And I never ignore the feeling of being watched. Because once you've felt it for real, you know what it means. Someone is out there, close enough to see you, choosing to stay hidden. That's what scared me the most. Not what I saw, but what I couldn't. I've spent a lot of time out in the woods, but one thing I learned the hard way is that nobody good ever comes to your camp in the middle of the night. Even if, by some chance, they mean no harm, you still don't want to meet them. I found that out on a solo hiking trip in the backcountry, and the memory has stuck with me ever since. It was late summer when I set out. The days were long, hot, and humid, the kind of weather where every step feels heavier with sweat. But the nights still dipped low enough that you needed to wrap yourself in your sleeping bag to keep the chill off. I'd been itching to get away for a while, to escape the noise of traffic and phones, to be somewhere the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the calls of animals in the distance. I planned a 4-day trip along a trail system that cut deep into a national forest. The first day was easy. Nothing but walking through thick trees, weaving along faint trails, and stopping every so often to sip water. I passed 2 other groups early in the day, but by mid-afternoon the crowds thinned, and by evening I hadn't seen another soul in hours. That was exactly what I wanted. When I set up camp on that first night, I picked a spot tucked back about 50 yards off the trail. I like having my tent out of sight so nobody passing by can stumble into it. It was a quiet little clearing, soft ground covered in pine needles, a couple of big trees that gave me natural cover, and just enough space for my tent and a small fire pit. As night fell, the forest got loud in its own way. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked somewhere down near a creek I'd crossed, and every so often a branch cracked in the distance as some animal moved around. That kind of noise doesn't bother me. What bothers me is silence, because silence means something is near, listening. That first night passed without issue, though. I ate my food, stared into the fire, then crawled into my tent. I was asleep not long after, lulled by the steady sound of insects. The next day was harder. I hiked deeper into the forest, following a section of trail that climbed steeply over rocky ground. The air felt heavier, more humid, and I had to stop often to catch my breath. I didn't see a single hiker that day. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the woods swallowed me whole. By the time the sun started dipping, I was exhausted and ready to stop. I found a spot near a ridge where the trees opened up just enough to give me a bit of a view through the branches. I pitched my tent, collected wood for a small fire, and settled in as the last light drained from the sky. That night was different. I had just finished eating when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The insects weren't nearly as loud, and I didn't hear any frogs at all. I brushed it off at first, telling myself maybe the temperature had dropped enough that the bugs settled down. But the quiet sat heavy in the back of my mind. When I finally put the fire out and crawled into my tent, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept hearing faint noises out in the trees. Not close, but not far either. A crack of a branch, the faint crunch of something stepping on dry leaves. I told myself it was deer moving around, maybe even a raccoon nosing through the woods. But it didn't sound random. The noises would start, then stop, as if something was creeping carefully. Sometime past midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. My tent was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed. Then I realized I wasn't hearing anything at all. No bugs, no frogs, no wind, just silence. I held my breath and listened, and after a few seconds, I caught it. The faint crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Slow, careful, deliberate. The sound froze me in place. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it had to be an animal, but every instinct in me said otherwise. These weren't the heavy, uneven steps of a deer or the quick scurry of a raccoon. These sounded human. The footsteps circled wide, moving around the edges of where my camp was set. Whoever it was never came too close, but I could hear the pattern. A few steps, pause, a few more, another pause, like they were checking the place out, testing how quiet they could be. I stayed completely still in my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe. My knife was tucked beside me, but I didn't move to grab it. Any noise I made would give me away. Minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. Finally, the sounds faded, swallowed by the trees. I lay there in the dark, wide awake, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't. When the first gray light of dawn crept into the tent, I packed up fast. I didn't even bother with breakfast. My gut screamed at me to get moving, so I shoved everything into my pack and started back on the trail. That whole day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the trail curved, I glanced over my shoulder. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I didn't see anyone, though. Not a hiker, not even a hunter. By late afternoon, I was worn out. I didn't want to stop, but I knew pushing too far when I was that tired could get me hurt. I picked a spot off the trail again, deeper this time, hidden among thick brush. I figured if I wasn't visible, I'd be safer. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I just sat in the dark, eating a cold meal, listening to the forest around me. And then, just like the night before, the silence came. I sat frozen, straining my ears. Sure enough, the same slow crunch of footsteps started up. They were closer this time. Whoever it was, they had followed me. The sound moved around the edge of my hidden camp, circling. My throat went dry. My palms were slick with sweat even though the night air was cool. I never saw them. I never heard them run off. But I knew they were out there, keeping just enough distance to avoid being seen, making sure I knew I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there in the dark, knife in hand, waiting. By dawn, I made my choice. I cut my trip short. I packed fast and hiked the trail hard, barely stopping to rest. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I didn't calm down until I saw other hikers again near the trailhead, smiling and chatting like nothing could possibly go wrong out here. I drove home that day, and I haven't done a solo trip that deep since. Because the truth is simple. Out there in the woods, in the middle of the night, nobody good ever comes to your camp. And even if they did, even if it was some lost hiker or some harmless person passing through, it wouldn't matter. The ones who mean no harm don't creep around silently. They don't watch from the dark. Whoever was out there those nights wasn't looking to say hello. They didn't want me to find them, and I didn't want to find out what they were waiting for. I've been hiking the woods around my town since I was a kid. They're not a national park or anything famous, just thick patches of trees and trails that run for miles in all directions. If you grew up here, you'd know that the woods are almost like another neighborhood of the town. Always there, always quiet, and always bigger than you expect. I've spent a lot of time out there, sometimes even walking until sunrise just to clear my head or get some peace away from everything. Most nights in the woods are uneventful. You hear the usual sounds: owls calling, branches cracking under deer, maybe the wind moving through the trees. Sometimes you don't hear much at all, and the silence itself feels heavy, like you've stepped into a place cut off from the world. I've gotten used to that feeling, though. I never really thought much about the woods being dangerous, at least not in the way most people think. Sure, there are coyotes around, and sometimes people dump junk out there, but I never felt like I was walking into anything I couldn't handle. That changed the night I came across the shanty town. It was late, sometime around 2 in the morning. I had left my place with a small backpack and a flashlight, though I usually tried to walk without it unless I needed it. The moon was bright enough to light up the path in patches, and I liked the way the woods looked under moonlight. It always felt different, like the trees themselves changed when the sun went down. My plan was to walk to a ridge about 3 miles in, sit there, and wait for the sunrise. I'd done it before. It was quiet, calming, and I figured it would help me shake off the restless feeling I'd had all day. About halfway there, though, I started seeing signs that someone had been moving through the woods before me. A crushed soda can here, a plastic bag caught in a bush, a couple of cigarette butts on the ground that looked fresh. Normally, I don't run into people out there that late. Most people are either at home sleeping or, at best, maybe camping closer to town. But someone had definitely been walking ahead of me. I didn't think too much about it at first. The woods are open to anyone, after all. But the deeper I went, the stranger it started to feel. The trash wasn't just a stray can or two. It became more frequent. Wrappers, bottles, even an old blanket balled up near a tree. It wasn't random either. It looked like a trail of someone's life being dragged through the woods. I thought maybe a homeless guy was living out here, or maybe some kids had been drinking and left their stuff behind. That would have made sense. But then I saw the glow through the trees. At first I thought it was someone's flashlight or maybe even headlights way off in the distance, but the glow was too steady, too warm. It flickered, and that told me it was fire. Out here, at that hour, with no campsites nearby, a fire didn't make sense. I slowed down, listening hard, half expecting to hear voices or laughter. But there was nothing, just the steady crackle that carried faintly through the trees. When I got closer, I stepped into a clearing and froze. In front of me was what looked like a makeshift little village, hidden deep in the woods. There were maybe 6 or 7 structures, if you could even call them that. Lean-tos built from bent branches, sheets tied between trees, panels of rusted scrap metal leaned together to form walls. Some were no taller than my chest. Others looked like they could fit a couple of people huddled inside. In the middle of it all was a fire pit, only instead of rocks, the pit was an old tire someone had set upright and filled with wood. Flames were licking up from it, low but steady, like it had been burning for a while. The strangest part was how quiet it was. Everything about the place said people should be there. The fire was going. A couple of sleeping bags were stretched out in two of the shacks. An old pot sat near the fire with what looked like beans or soup inside, still warm. A backpack leaned against a tree, half unzipped. Someone had gone to the trouble of building this place, keeping a fire burning, leaving belongings all around, and yet there wasn't a soul in sight. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, listening. The woods were dead silent, not even crickets. My first thought was that maybe everyone had gone off to get water or to do something in the trees. But in the middle of the night, with food cooking and fire left burning, that didn't sit right with me. I stepped carefully into the camp. The ground around the fire was packed flat, the way it gets when a lot of feet have trampled over it. I could see footprints in the dirt, some big, some small, maybe a dozen different sets. The huts weren't just thrown together either, they'd been lived in. Blankets, empty cans, clothes hanging from branches. It wasn't one person, it was a group. But where were they? I moved slowly, my nerves on edge now. The fire popped, and the sound made me jump more than it should have. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out of the trees. The longer I stood there, the heavier the silence felt. It was like the woods were holding their breath. That was when it hit me. Maybe they hadn't left. Maybe they were still here, watching me. The idea lodged in my head and wouldn't shake loose. There were plenty of places someone could stand, just beyond the reach of the firelight, and I wouldn't see them. They could be in the trees, crouched behind one of the shacks, waiting. I scanned the shadows again and again, trying to spot movement, but nothing shifted. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked around the edge of the camp, looking at the shacks one by one. One had an old mattress on the ground, stained and torn. Another had what looked like kids' shoes lined neatly by the entrance. I found a jacket draped over a branch, heavy with dampness. These weren't things someone would abandon easily. Whoever had lived here planned on coming back. The thought made me uneasy. If they came back right now, I'd be standing in the middle of their camp with no good reason to be there. And in the middle of the night, in the woods, nobody good ever walks into a stranger's camp. Even if they weren't dangerous, it wouldn't be safe for me. I realized I needed to leave. I backed away from the fire, keeping my eyes on the huts. My skin crawled with the sense that eyes were on me, following me, even though I couldn't see anyone. The fire crackled again, and I flinched at the sound. I turned and started walking fast, not running but not wasting any time either. Every step felt too loud, and the woods felt tighter around me, as if the trees themselves were leaning in. I didn't look back until I was a good distance away, maybe 100 yards. When I finally turned my head, the glow of the fire was still visible through the trees. And that's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the glow, just for a second. It was a shape, tall, human, passing between the fire and one of the shacks. By the time I blinked, it was gone. That was all the confirmation I needed. Someone had been there the entire time. Maybe more than one. They just didn't want me to see them. I didn't stick around to figure out why. I pushed myself to walk faster, then faster still until I was nearly jogging through the trees. My heart hammered in my chest, and every sound, the crunch of leaves under my boots, the snap of a branch somewhere off to my left, made me flinch. I didn't stop until I was out of the woods and back on the streetlights of my town. I never went back to that spot. For weeks after, though, I thought about it. I thought about the fire, the food still warm in the pot, the belongings that looked like they'd just been set down. Whoever built that shanty town had meant to come back, and they had. I'd seen the shadow, seen the proof. The only reason they hadn't stepped out when I was there was because they didn't want me to find them. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much worse that was. If it had just been an empty camp, I could have brushed it off as people moving on. If someone had stepped out and confronted me, it would have been terrifying, but at least it would have been clear. Instead, I had walked straight into the middle of their home, stood among their things, and they had silently watched me the entire time, letting me go. That silence said more than words ever could. It told me I was somewhere I didn't belong, and it told me that whoever they were, whatever reason they had for living hidden out in those woods, they weren't the kind of people you wanted to meet in the middle of the night. I've gone hiking my whole life, and the woods around where I live have always felt like an extension of home. I know the trails, the streams, and even the side paths that most people don't bother with. I usually hike alone, sometimes at odd hours, and I've grown used to the feeling of being watched by the trees or hearing the creaks and groans of the forest at night. Normally, it's peaceful, but there was one time where it wasn't just the woods making noise. It started when a group of us decided to do a night hike. There were 8 of us total, friends from town who were used to long trails, camping out, and doing the kind of stuff people would probably call reckless. We weren't worried, though. 8 people together in the woods feels almost safer than walking alone through a city. We had flashlights, backpacks, and gear for an overnight stay. The plan was simple: hike a long loop, camp out halfway, then head back the next day. Nothing special. The first few hours were fun. We joked around, stopped to snack, and walked along the trails that twisted through thick patches of pines. By midnight, the woods had gone dead quiet. No crickets, no frogs, no rustle of wind. Just the crunch of our boots on dirt and leaves. That silence was heavy, and it set everyone a little on edge, though no one said much about it. We just kept moving. It was around then that the first weird thing happened. Up ahead, through the trees, we saw a faint flicker. At first, I thought it was just another group of campers with a fire going. But when we got closer, the light didn't look right. It wasn't steady. It jumped and dimmed like someone was walking with a torch or a lantern. That was odd. Who uses a lantern anymore in the woods? We stopped for a minute to look. The light seemed to move, then vanish, then reappear further off. Nobody wanted to be the one to suggest turning around, so we just pushed on, making our way closer. When we finally reached the spot where the light had been, there was nothing. No fire, no people, no sound. Just damp earth and old leaves. We laughed it off, but I remember thinking about how big we were as a group. 8 people is no small number. If someone was really out there, they'd have to be stupid or reckless to mess with us. Drugs was my first thought too. Maybe some tweaker out here doing things that didn't make sense. We kept walking, but the mood had changed. Everyone was quieter, scanning the trees with their flashlights. The beam would catch on branches, rocks, or empty spaces between trunks that looked darker than they should. It was one of those moments where you realize how blind you really are in the woods at night. The flashlight only shows you a small cone of light, and everything else beyond that feels like a void. The second strange thing happened an hour later. We came to a small clearing and stopped to take a break. As we sat down, we noticed something. All around the clearing, in about a half circle, were small piles of sticks leaning against trees. At first glance, it looked like something kids might build if they were messing around. But these piles weren't random. They were stacked carefully, with bark stripped from some of the branches. Each one leaned at the same angle, like they'd been set up on purpose. Nobody said much about it. We just kind of ignored it, pretending it wasn't strange. But I kept thinking, who does that in the middle of the woods? Who spends time arranging sticks around a clearing like that? We got moving again, and not long after, we started hearing noises. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. Leaves crunching, branches snapping, always off to the side, sometimes behind us. It never came close enough to catch with a flashlight, but it was there, following, stopping when we stopped, walking when we walked. We picked up the pace and the sounds faded, but not for long. It was like whoever or whatever was out there wanted us to know they were there. Not attacking, not even showing themselves. Just reminding us that we weren't alone. By 3 in the morning, we were all on edge. We finally found a spot to set up camp. A small rise surrounded by trees. Felt safer than the low ground. We built a fire, put up tents, and tried to relax. Some of us lay down right away, but I stayed up, sitting near the fire with 2 others. The night was still silent, too silent. Then came the worst part. Sometime after, when most of the group was asleep, we heard something again. This time, it wasn't just branches snapping. It was the distinct sound of whistling. Slow, drawn-out, broken whistling that didn't carry a tune. It came from the dark woods just beyond the glow of the fire. Every muscle in my body went tight. My mind ran through all the possibilities. Some guy strung out on drugs? Someone trying to scare us? Whoever it was, they weren't right. Nobody good comes to your camp in the middle of the night, and even if they do, you still don't want to meet them. We didn't move. We just sat there listening, staring into the dark, waiting for something to step out. Nothing ever did. The whistling went on for a while, then stopped. When morning came, we were all drained. Nobody had slept well. We packed up fast and decided to cut the loop short, heading back the fastest way possible. On the trail, we saw more signs. Footprints in the mud that didn't belong to us. Fresh and too close for comfort. In one spot, someone had carved a shape into a tree, just a crude X cut deep into the bark. The whole hike back, we felt watched. The movement in the woods didn't stop until we were nearly out. Once we reached the familiar paths closer to town, everything went quiet again, like whoever had been out there was satisfied letting us go. We never saw them, and we never figured out who it was. But I know what I felt. They didn't want to fight us, and they didn't want to be found. They just wanted us gone. Whoever they were, their goal was to scare us away, and it worked. We never did another night hike in that area again. Even now, when I go back into those woods alone, I think about it. The sound of that whistling, the stick piles, the feeling of eyes in the dark. Someone was out there that night. Someone who knew the forest better than us. Someone who wanted to remind us it wasn't ours. And the truth is, that's worse than anything supernatural, because it means they're still out there, and they could be watching anyone who decides to wander too deep, especially at night. I was younger when I first heard about the old abandoned mansion. A few of my buddies told me about it, but at the time I didn't take it all that seriously. Everyone had heard rumors about it. Some said it was owned by people who left it sitting empty. Some claimed squatters had moved in, and others insisted the neighbors were so tired of trespassers that they called the cops every chance they got. The house itself had this sort of myth built up around it, which only made me more curious. I was the kind of person who couldn't leave things alone once I got an idea in my head, and back then I wasn't exactly full of good judgment. So one afternoon, I decided to check it out myself. I pulled up the address online, typed it into my phone's GPS, and tried to figure out a way in that wouldn't put me directly in view of the neighbors. The problem was obvious. If I went up the front way, anyone watching would see me, and if they were as quick to call the cops as everyone claimed, I'd be done before I even reached the property. I wasn't looking to get arrested or fined for trespassing, so I thought I'd outsmart the whole situation. I figured I'd take the back way through the woods instead. I knew the trails nearby, especially Meadowdale Beach Trail, and since the mansion wasn't too far off from there, I thought it would be simple enough. I didn't think about how tricky it might be to actually cut through woods where there weren't clear paths, or how easy it would be to lose my bearings. In my head, it was just a quick detour, a straight shot from the trail to the house. I set out in the middle of the day, sometime after lunch. The sky was overcast, but it wasn't threatening rain. The trees were thick enough to block a lot of the light, though, so the woods had that heavy, muted feeling where you couldn't quite tell the time by looking around. I walked for a while on the official trail before checking my phone. The map told me the house wasn't far off, so I stepped off the dirt path and started weaving my way through the underbrush. At first, it wasn't too bad. The ground was soft with pine needles and leaves, and there were gaps between the trees wide enough to squeeze through without much effort. My shoes crunched lightly, and every step seemed to echo in my ears. I kept glancing at the little blue dot on my phone, trying to line myself up with where I thought the house should be. After a while, I noticed how quiet it was. No voices, no wind, not even the usual sound of birds. It felt wrong, but I kept telling myself it was just because I was distracted by where I was going. I climbed over a few fallen logs, pushed through some ferns, and kept moving closer to where the dot on my phone told me I needed to be. That was when I stumbled out onto something I didn't expect at all. Instead of more woods, I found myself standing at the edge of a strange, paved back road in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on the map, and I had no clue where it led. It wasn't wide, but it was paved and looked maintained enough that cars definitely used it. Seeing that stretch of asphalt cut through the forest like that completely threw me off. I froze there for a few seconds, standing half hidden behind some brush, staring at the road. On one side of it was the direction I had come from. On the other was a steep, tree-covered hill that rose up sharply. I remember thinking how odd it was to find a road like that so deep in the woods, but then I thought I heard the sound of a car. The noise was faint, just the kind of low hum you tell yourself you didn't actually hear. Still, it was enough to make me panic. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't want to get caught standing in the open like that, so without thinking twice, I scrambled up the hill on the opposite side. It was steep, the dirt sliding under my shoes as I clawed at roots and rocks to keep myself from sliding back down. My legs burned by the time I reached the top, and I was breathing hard, crouched low to keep from being too obvious. When I finally looked up, expecting to see just more trees, I froze again. Spread out in a small clearing at the top of the hill was a group of tents. Not one or two, but at least a dozen of them. They were different shapes and sizes, some small backpacking tents, others bigger like what families might use. They were close together, too close for it to just be random campers. It didn't look like the kind of place people stumbled into for a night outdoors. It looked set up, almost permanent, like a small camp hidden away from the world. The time of day made it even stranger. It was around 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and I was at least a solid half hour's walk from the main trail. The only way to get there seemed to be that hidden back road, and yet here was this whole cluster of tents. No people were visible at first, but the place had the kind of stillness that didn't feel empty. I could feel eyes on me even though I didn't see anyone. My stomach twisted. Every instinct told me I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. My brain raced with explanations: homeless camp, squatters, people hiding from something, maybe even drugs. Whatever it wasn't good. It wasn't the kind of camp you casually stumble across on a weekend hike. I didn't stick around to find out more. The fear hit me fast and sharp, and I started easing backward, careful not to make noise. My shoes slid against the dirt as I tried to keep steady, my hands gripping branches to slow myself. I wanted to get back down that hill without drawing attention, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting someone to step out from one of those tents at any second. When I finally made it back to the road, I crouched low again and darted across, heart pounding, convinced headlights were about to appear around the bend. Once I reached the other side, I didn't care about direction anymore. I just wanted to get away from there. I pushed through the trees, thorns scratching my arms, branches snapping against my shoulders, until I finally recognized the trail again. By the time I got back, my legs were trembling and sweat soaked through my shirt. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me. Nobody ever came, but that didn't calm me down. Even once I was back in my car, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I never told my buddies the full story about what I saw. I just said I couldn't find the mansion that day, which technically wasn't a lie. I did eventually go back on another trip and see the mansion itself, but that camp I found in the woods stuck with me far more. I don't know what those tents were for or who stayed in them, but I know enough to be sure it wasn't anything good. You don't put a dozen tents in the middle of the woods on a hidden hill beside a road that doesn't appear on maps unless you're trying to stay out of sight. And you don't want people stumbling into a place like that. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was. I could have walked straight into someone there, and if they didn't want me leaving with the memory of what I saw, things could have gone bad fast. I was just some dumb kid chasing curiosity, but that day taught me a lesson that stuck. When you're hiking or wandering into places you don't fully understand, you don't always know what you're stepping into. Sometimes it's not the woods or the wildlife you need to be afraid of. It's the people who choose to hide themselves there. That day, I slipped away unnoticed. But if anyone had seen me at the top of that hill, standing frozen in front of their hidden camp, I don't think the story would have ended as quietly as it did.